Welcome to the Colonel Pride Review. Today we will learn how Bermuda became England's first successful colony. It is a story that forms part of the birth of the British Empire, and it is a great adventure in its own right. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you. A fleet of 7 ships was sailing the Atlantic. The year was 1609. The flagship of the fleet was the Sea Venture, a thoroughly modern 300-ton galleon. The destination was Jamestown, Virginia, the site of an English colony founded only 2 years before. But the Sea Venture was never to reach it. The ship had approximately 150 people aboard. Sailors, settlers, men and women up and down the social ladder, including the designated governor of Virginia, Sir Thomas Gates, and the admiral of the fleet, Sir George Somers, both of whom had already had exotic and varied naval and military careers. Both had fought the Spanish, but now on July 23rd, they were about to do battle with the Atlantic itself. A hurricane swept the ocean and scattered the ships of the fleet. The Sea Venture found itself alone and lost in a seemingly endless cannonade of rain and wind. Somers, the experienced mariner, turned the ship to go in the direction the wind and waves were blowing, the safest means of preventing the ship being capsized by the power of the sea. He remained constantly on the poop deck, piloting the ship, struggling to keep it upright and save the lives of everyone aboard. The tempest continued to what must have seemed to the passengers an eternity. Some of the waves were so gargantuan that they actually engulfed momentarily from stern to bow the entire ship, causing panic. But amazingly, Somers was as yet able to keep the ship afloat, even while hearts were sinking. In horror, they found that the water was rising inside the ship. It was not only that the water from the waves was getting inside, but that the ship was leaking. They scrambled to find the source, but with no success. All they could do was desperately bail out the water. For 3 days, every man aboard, from the lowliest laborer to the most genteel aristocrat, used every bucket or other improvised container to continually bail out the water. All the while, George Somers stayed at his post on the poop deck, keeping the ship upright, keeping everyone alive. For 3 nights, he barely ate or slept. On the 3rd day, the crew and the passengers had all but given up. The very idea that such a powerful storm could persist so long was incredible to them. With the storm showing no signs of abating, they opened up the best liquor stored in the ship and drank to each other's memory, promising to see each other in the next life, giving up on the new world in America. They then slumped, exhausted, and slept as best they could, waiting with an alcoholic courage for death. It was the morning of the 4th day. The power of the tempest did show sign of declining, but the rising waters inside the Sea Venture were sure to sink the ship and kill the English. George Somers was still at his post. No doubt half delirious from fatigue, Somers sighted something in the distance. He must have barely been able to believe his eyes, or his good fortune. There was land. Not Virginia, of course. They were far too distant and completely off course, but land nonetheless. He roused his comrades. If they could sustain their energy just a little while longer, continue bailing out water, then maybe, just maybe, the Sea Venture could reach safety. The inebriated and exhausted crew, already half reconciled to death, got back to work. Somers, the other sailors, and any passengers well read on New World geography would certainly have had an idea about what land they were approaching. And what they knew was not good. They were approaching the Isle of Devils. In the clear, shallow seas they were now sailing through, Somers could make out the reefs and rocks that presented a barrier between the Sea Venture and this land. Somers took a desperate gamble, piloting the ship through notoriously dangerous waters. Half a mile from shore, the ship became lodged between rocks, but it was upright and intact. bidding farewell to the sea venture, the crew and passengers got themselves into boats, along with whatever supplies they could salvage, and rowed themselves the remaining half-mile to the shore. They had arrived in Bermuda. Bermuda is a collection of volcanic islands sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 650 miles from the American mainland, an ideal stopping off point on the journey across the Atlantic from Europe, but in 1609, as yet uncolonized and uninhabited. As it turns out, the English would be the first human beings to live permanently in this land. The Spanish can claim to have first discovered it, and one may question why they had not taken the time to settle such an extremely strategic location. There are two parts to the answer. First, the Spanish were glutted with colonies further south, which they had much trouble peopling as it was, and secondly, Bermuda was surrounded by dangerous reefs and rocks, a good place to wreck a ship. And so while the Spanish gave it the official name Bermuda after the first Spanish captain to find it, it was colloquially known as the Isle of Devils for the great danger that resided there for unwary ships. Before we see how our adventurers do in their unexpected destination, let's take a step back and find out who these people were and why they were crossing the Atlantic in 1609. They were headed for Virginia. In 1606, two Virginia companies were established in England, the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth. The former was to establish settlements around the Chesapeake, and the latter to do so further north in New England. At the time, the name Virginia was applied by the English, in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, to most of the eastern seaboard of North America. In 1607, the Plymouth Company established a settlement in what we now call Maine, but abandoned it after only 14 months. The London Company established Jamestown on the River James within the borders of the modern US state of Virginia, founded on May 14, 1607, marking the beginning of permanent English settlement in North America. It was not in fact the first attempt to do so. Sir Walter Raleigh had previously established a settlement at Roanoke, further south in what we now call North Carolina, but that colony and all its settlers had been poorly supplied by the home country and then lost, swallowed up by the vast and mysterious continent. These were England's first tentative steps towards colonialism. For the past century, English involvement in the Americas involved sailing over, sacking a few Spanish towns, and then going home again with the booty. That is to say, piracy, not settlement. Walter Raleigh's Roanoke scheme had itself been envisaged as a base for piracy. The establishment of the Virginia companies represented a significant evolution in the English approach. Rather than an adventurous mariner like Raleigh, backed by a few wealthy partners, the companies brought in a large number of financial backers and a permanent management. Settlement, the extraction of resources, and the planting of cash crops were the stated objectives. They pinned their hopes on finding land suitable for silk production, spices, cotton, anything that England itself could not produce itself and was dependent on imports for. Piracy was, at least officially, out for the time being because of King James's pro-Spanish foreign policy. The company studied the previous English failure at Roanoke and determined to ensure firm leadership and regular supply. The fleet commanded by George Somers was bringing additional settlers and much-needed food and equipment to Jamestown in a convoy called the Third Supply. Sir Thomas Gates was supposed to be bringing the experience and social standing that 17th century Englishmen saw as key to good leadership. Jamestown definitely needed the support. In the 2 years since its establishment, most of the original colonists had already died from disease and hunger. As for the passengers of the Sea Venture, it included all of the highest-ranking figures of the Third Supply fleet. Besides Gates and Somers, there was Captain Newport, who had already been to Virginia and would have a long colonial career. Men of similarly high social class who were aboard with them, because it was felt that they should be able to socialize together on the journey over. The consequence of this was that the other ships of the fleet, which did in fact successfully make it to Jamestown, were left leaderless. To make matters worse, the company's instructions for what to do after arrival were aboard the Sea Venture so the other ships arrived in Virginia leaderless and directionless. The only positive I can see from having all the authority figures in one ship is that it included far more than its fair share of literary gentlemen, giving us some good sources for the events on Bermuda. In particular, William Strachey would write a detailed account which would go on, so the theory goes, to inspire William Shakespeare to write The Tempest. Further down the hierarchy, the sea venture included some men with useful skills for settling the New World, who we will meet in our narrative. 2 more passengers deserve special mention. They had with them 2 Powhatan natives of Virginia, Namontack and Machumps, that Captain Newport had previously brought to England and were now supposed to be returned to their home. Back to our adventurers. The exhausted people found themselves on the northeast coast of Bermuda, at what is now called Gates Bay. Miraculously, none had died in the storm aboard the Sea Venture, nor in the crossing in small boats from the ship to the island. Sir George Somers and his sailors had done phenomenal work. Large amounts of luggage and equipment were also brought over in the boats from the Sea Venture, but the bulk of their food and water was lost, covered in seawater. For all their weariness, the small community would have to get right to work in order to survive. They found they could extract fresh water from digging reasonably shallow wells, thanks to the large amount of rain that had just fallen on the island. Later, they found potable water in ponds also. They used sails from the ship to make awnings, and harvested the leaves of the palmetto plant to make roofs for simple shelters. The settlers also found part of the palmetto tree to be edible. As William Strachey put it, roasting the palmetto, or soft top thereof, they had a taste like fried melons, or, being sod, they eat like cabbages. Other sources of food were soon found. George Somers, the expert mariner, once again put his skills to the advantage of the expedition. He took a team fishing, and in a single hour, took enough fish to supply the 150 colonists for a day. The English found that the island was abundant in fish and easy to catch. They also found large numbers of wild hogs on the island. This should have been a surprise. Pigs are an old world animal. Presumably, the pigs had been left by their Spanish visitors or had survived a shipwreck. Once again, Somers was the great pioneer. He built himself a small boat and took a team hunting. They returned from a small hunting trip with 32 pigs to share with their fellows. Besides fish and pork, they found edible berries and roots, birds that could be caught easily by the hand, nests of eggs, and great turtles that could feed dozens of men. To the Englishman's great surprise, food was not a massive problem in this adventure. The only disappointment was Somers' attempt to plant a garden using seeds retrieved from the Sea Venture was not a success. Another great boon was the temperate, breezy climate that was found to be healthy for Englishmen. For all this luck, Thomas Gates had no intention of keeping the expedition in Bermuda. He commanded the longboat of the Sea Venture to be refitted. It was a 20-odd foot long rowing boat, one of the boats used to ferry the passengers onto the island. Over the course of a month, it was converted into a sailing boat by the talented shipwright Richard Frobisher, using salvaged materials from the Sea Venture. The plan was for the pilot, Henry Ravens, to take the longboat and complete the journey to Virginia, accompanied by 6 sailors, then to bring a ship back to Bermuda to rescue the rest of the expedition. Henry Ravens and his crew left on the 28th of August. It took them 2 days to find a safe passage through the rocks and reefs that surrounded Bermuda, but they finally made it out and disappeared into the western horizon. The whole island must have prayed for their safe and speedy success. They were never heard from again, lost to the Atlantic. Our adventurers will have to find another way off Bermuda. Despite the success in providing for the basic needs of the community, Governor Gates faced great challenges in managing the relations amongst his people and in maintaining his authority. There were some fundamental problems. First, the community was divided between sailor and settler. The sailors manning the ships of the Third Supply were not destined for New World colonization. Their job was to deliver the cargo and people to Jamestown and then return to England. They saw themselves as a class apart from the townsmen. Secondly, the nature of Gates's authority was questionable at best. He was governor of Virginia, not Bermuda, and George Somers, as admiral, was in command for the sea journey. They have now made landfall, but in the wrong place. So on whom does final authority lay? These frictions would soon lead to dissent. The first hint of frayed discipline was a fight between two sailors, Robert Waters and Edward Samuel. They came to blows, and Robert Waters picked up a shovel and beat Edward Samuel round the head with it, killing him. Robert Waters was detained, and quite conventionally for the times, Governor Gates sentenced him to hang. But before the sentence could be carried out, Robert Waters was set free by his fellow sailors and allowed to escape into the wooded parts of the island, where he was supplied with food by his friends. Perhaps the sailors liked Waters more than poor dead Samuel. Perhaps they resented Governor Gates' authority in these unusual circumstances. In any case, it was a direct challenge to Gates, and it was going to get worse. Gates found himself powerless to force Waters out of the forest or to get the sailors to retrieve him. George Somers visited Gates to resolve the impasse. Somers convinced Gates to pardon Waters, who then returned to camp and resumed work. That a felon sentenced to death should be reprieved is not in itself shocking in the English legal tradition. That it should be extracted in these circumstances for the crime of outright murder is. Gates and Somers probably both believed that having Waters living free in the woods would be a festering wound in the colony, undermining all authority, and bringing him back to regular discipline was vital. But it made Gates look weak, and it exacerbated the division between the sailor and the landsman that went right to the top. Somers himself believed he should be in overall command until they reached Virginia, and this case brought that contradiction right to the forefront. The two men may well have argued fiercely over the issue, but they also, to their credit, managed to maintain a professional relationship throughout their time in Bermuda. They agreed to separate into two camps. Somers took his sailors to live and work separately. The two commanders maintained regular communication, and both camps were supplied from one main store. So this shouldn't be seen as an absolute split in the expedition. Rather, an attempt to work around and reduce tensions and disagreements while continuing to cooperate. Nonetheless, it emphasizes just how serious those disagreements were, and one suspects lesser men than Gates and Somers would have come to outright conflict in these circumstances. In fact, early colonial history provides plenty of examples of that. As hope of being retrieved by Henry Raven from Virginia faded away, a new plan was formed. The Gates camp and the Somers camp would each construct a sailing ship using materials salvaged from the Sea Venture and Bermuda's own abundant cedar trees. In fact, the original plan was to build just one ship and to take half the expedition to Virginia and then come back later for the rest. But the question of exactly who would be left behind had been too damaging to morale, and so the plan became for two ships to take everyone together to Virginia. As this work progressed, however, social tensions continued to boil over. A new factor was involved. Life in Bermuda was reasonably comfortable. They had ample food, a pleasant climate, and no native population to fight with. Now, the Virginia Company had been very careful in its propaganda in England to advertise how good life would be in Virginia, so as to attract more investors and more settlers. But some people aboard the Sea Venture had been to Virginia already, and word slowly got around that Jamestown was not everything it was cracked up to be, that it was in fact a place of hunger, disease, and conflict. And so sailors and settlers alike looked around them and decided they were better off in Bermuda than continuing the journey. This feeling was first demonstrated in lackluster efforts on the construction of the two ships, but would soon emerge as outright mutiny. The first conspiracy involved a group of men who planned to abscond from the camp and make their own homes in another part of Bermuda, away from the authority of either Gates or Somers, where they could live as their own masters. Someone informed on them, and the 6 men were arrested and brought before Gates for trial. The conventional punishment for mutiny was hanging, but once again, Gates displayed mercy. He had the men banished to a small island and left there with a regular supply of minimal food, and there they were kept until they petitioned to be readmitted to the settlement, which they were. The next was a smaller affair, but showed the rot had reached into those parts of the community that should have been most dependable. Stephen Hopkins was a clerk from Hampshire, a family man who had left his wife and children in England to join the adventure. He was a Puritan, that is, a radical Protestant who wanted the Church of England to rid itself of lingering features of Catholicism, a stock of people who would become important in the history of English colonization of the Americas, but at this point have not yet had their time in the sun. In this expedition, he had acted as assistant to the Anglican minister and was noted to know his Bible very well. Besides religion, it seems he had very particular opinions about politics and sociology, and it is worth quoting an account of his recorded views in full. Stephen Hopkins alleged substantial arguments, both civil and divine, the scripture falsely quoted, that it was no breach of honesty, conscience, nor religion to decline from the obedience of the governor or refuse to go any further, led by his authority, except it so pleased themselves, since the authority ceased when the wreck was committed, and with it they were all then freed from the government of any man, and for a matter of conscience it was not unknown to the meanest how much we were therein bound each one to provide for himself and his own family. The suggestion of man existing entirely without government and able to follow their own conscience may represent some embryonic form of liberalism, but this wasn't going to win you friends in high places in 1609, and from the point of view of the times, seems to be agitating for mutiny, particularly as he went on to suggest that he and his friends could and should freely choose to stay in Bermuda. He was arrested and brought before Gates. Hopkins begged for his life, saying his family back in England needed him, and Gates, perhaps now not surprisingly, pardoned him. The third attempt at some kind of mutiny, according to William Strachey, who recorded these events, was the most serious of them all and involved a plan by a significant number of sailors and settlers to seize control of the store and overthrow the authority of Gates for good. Once again, an informer had come forward. Gates did not order an arrest of the accused conspirators, instead arranging for a close eye to be kept on them and for his loyalists to take better precautions to be ready for trouble. To divide up the supposed conspirators, some were sent to George Somers' camp. In this tense atmosphere, one of the conspirators, a gentleman named Henry Plaine, had a fierce argument with his commander. It's not clear from the record who this commander was, except that it wasn't Gates or Somers. Whoever it was, Plaine struck him and vented all his anger about Gates, saying the governor had no right or authority over him or anyone. Henry Plaine was detained and brought before Gates. Gates' patience was out. A gentleman like Plaine should know better. He was sentenced to be hanged. Plaine asked that, as a gentleman, he should be shot instead. Gates consented to this request, and Henry Plaine was shot that evening. This was far from the end of the matter, though. That portion of the conspirators who had been sent to George Somers' camp, hearing that Plaine was dead, decided to run for the woods, fearing that Plaine could have implicated them before he died. Once again, the expedition was threatened by the prospect of an ongoing separation. In fact, this group of men included Robert Waters, the man we met earlier, who had murdered his fellow sailor, as well as a man who'd been involved in the previous mutiny named Christopher Carter. Gates enlisted Somers to help him bring the men back. They initially responded to his entreaties with a petition of their own, not only demanding the right to stay in Bermuda, but also asking for clothes and food. Gates, through Somers, responded that they had a duty to the Virginia Company that had sent them, and to their king, who had blessed their endeavor, to continue the expedition. And ultimately, Somers was able to convince all but 2 of them to return. Those 2 men who did not return were Robert Waters and Christopher Carter. Of course, not everything was conflict. The work on the ships progressed, and elements of conventional English life continued in the little community. The Sea Venture's cook, Welshman Thomas Powell, took a liking to a young maidservant, Elizabeth Person, and the community celebrated a merry English marriage. 2 children were also born on the islands, a boy and a girl. The boy named Bermudas, and the girl Bermuda, the first English births in this new English colony. The father of the girl was one John Rolfe, who had joined the expedition to Jamestown with his pregnant wife. Rolfe is known to history for his later conjugal affairs. He is the future husband of Pocahontas. In May 1610, 9 months after the wreck of the Sea Venture, the 2 ships were ready. They were christened Deliverance and Patience, the first name in hope, the second in honor of the quality that enabled their perseverance. The 2 ships were loaded with provisions, and on the 10th of May they departed Bermuda together. They had left England with 150 people. The vast majority were still alive. In the annals of 17th century Atlantic colonialism, this is quite an achievement in of itself. 2 men were left behind, the quarrelsome Robert Waters and Christopher Carter, who could now emerge from their wooded hiding place as lords of all Bermuda. For Gates and his people, their travails were far from over. They made it to Jamestown, finally, on the 21st of May. Far from Jamestown being a salvation to the former occupants of the Sea Venture, though, it was Jamestown that needed help. William Strachey reports his impression. Viewing the fort, we found the palisades torn down, the ports open, the gates from off the hinges, and empty houses, which owners' death had taken from them, rent up and burnt. Rather than the dwellers would step into the woods a stone cast off from them to fetch other firewood. And it is true, the Indian killed as fast without, if our men stirred but beyond the bounds of their blockhouse, as famine and pestilence did within, with many more particularities of their sufferances brought upon them by their own disorders the last year than I have heart to express. Gates' commission was read out, and he assumed command. The most immediate problem was food. Far from the easy bounty of Bermuda, the people of Jamestown were starving. Despite having been augmented by the other ships of the third supply, the population of the colony was only about 60 people. Gates decided to call it quits. The surviving colonists loaded into ships and prepared to abandon Virginia. Just as they were leaving, they were intercepted by a new supply convoy from England commanded by Lord Delaware, as new governor, replacing Gates, who in England was presumed dead. And so the colonists unloaded once again and continued their difficult existence in the New World. But that is a story for another time. What of Bermuda? Sir George Somers was sent back to Bermuda by the new governor to collect provisions for Jamestown. He set sail with the ship, Patience, that he had built himself there in Bermuda. He became sick on the journey, and not long after arriving back in Bermuda, he died on November the 9th, 1610. From obscure origins in Lyme Regis, in Dorset, he had had an illustrious career fighting the Spanish in the Caribbean, and from his actions in this narrative, we can see he was an incredibly capable and talented seaman and commander. Before dying, he exhorted his men to complete their mission and return with food to Jamestown. In fact, they decided to sail home to England instead. They left behind a man named Edward Shard, who joined Robert Waters and Christopher Carter. The castaways would not have Bermuda to themselves for long. 2 years later, in 1612, the deliberate settlement of the islands began with the arrival of colonists dispatched from the Virginia Company, and Bermuda would remain connected to England, then to Britain, right up to the present day. In 1615, a group of Virginia Company insiders would purchase the company's rights to Bermuda and establish a separate, if closely related company, the Somers Isles Company, named for Sir George Somers, who did so much to ensure the survival of the Sea Venture castaways in this story. While Virginia can claim an older provenance, Bermuda can claim to be the first really successful English colony. It was the first to have a truly settled self-reproducing population, the first to be economically successful, a truly transplanted English community in the New World. It would take Virginia decades to achieve this. Why was it so successful? A good, healthy environment and abundant sources of food. It would have 3,000 people by 1630. Virginians were planting tobacco before the Bermuda settlers, but Bermuda succeeded more quickly in creating a profitable colonial economy from the wicked weed. They would also be the first to discover that tobacco drains the soil of nutrients. A tobacco planter has to move on to new lands, which was an option on the continent of America, but not within the small islands of Bermuda. And so Bermuda evolved beyond the cash crop plantation colonial model. It gradually became a seafaring community, and for most of the 17th century, its main export would be people. Bermuda became a school of colonialism. Englishmen who had first settled or been born in Bermuda would then assume key roles in the colonization of the Caribbean and continental America. We met earlier in this narrative one Stephen Hopkins, spared from a hanging by the clemency of Governor Gates. Hopkins, as mentioned, was a Puritan, and he would ultimately give up on Virginia and join the Mayflower expedition, the famous pilgrims who settled in New England. His life thus connects three of England's earliest colonies. Many men like him in the following years would choose Bermuda as a place of settlement, and from there, Puritan adventurers would engage in many colonial expeditions, great and small. It is these adventures that I want to examine in my upcoming videos, starting with Puritans and Pirates of the Caribbean, where I will describe how Puritans from Bermuda and England ventured into the heart of the Spanish West Indies. For now, I want to thank you all for listening. Do me a favor, like and subscribe. I'll be uploading new historical content very soon. Thank you very much.